I spent a lot of time with my maternal grandparents when I was growing up. In the family photo albums, there are a lot of pictures of me as a toddler spending my days with my grandparents as my mom and dad were working. And as I got older and as my mom was able to stay home with us, I still got to spend a lot of time with my grandparents. They lived only 5 minutes away from us, and so whenever my parents went out for the evening, Grandma and Grandpa were always there to watch my 3 siblings and I. One of the best parts of my childhood was when we were dropped off at Grandma and Grandpa's house for sleepovers. My 3 siblings and I, we would lay our sleeping bags out in my grandparents' living room, and we would eat pizza, drink soda, have ice cream and candy, and watch all the movies we want until we crashed and fell asleep on their living room floor. Having spent so much time with them, I have these lasting images of my grandparents. And one of the ones that I carry around of my grandmother was her love of soap operas. She was always watching them. I need to watch my soaps, she would say to us. And so she'd go to the kitchen, she'd grab one of those iced Starbucks Frappuccino drinks, the glass bottles from the fridge, and she'd fill a glass full of ice and pour her drink over that ice, and then she'd find her favorite spot on the love seat in her living room, and then she would flip on her TV. She had one of those archaic, archetype type of televisions. The ones that used to be pieces of furniture in the living room, the ones with the dials on it. And so she would watch her soap operas. She'd sip on her Frappuccino, and she'd watch every soap opera imaginable, Days of Our Lives, The Young and the Restless, All My Children, and she never missed them. On top of that ancient TV was 2 VCRs. You guys remember VCRs, right? And she had tons of blank VHS tapes, and so she would record one soap opera while watching another one. When asked how she could watch shows that had such over-the-top drama, that were rife with terrible acting, crazy moral dilemmas, and ridiculous plot points, weird family dynamics, my grandma responded by saying, seeing stories of people with so many dramatic problems made hers seem smaller. My grandmother's soaps have nothing on the book of Genesis. The biblical account of the beginning of humankind's relationship with God, in the words of the Rabbi Burton Vistovsky, unfold like the longest-running soap opera in history. Brothers murdering each other or selling one another into slavery, a crazy love triangle between Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, blatant favoritism shown for one child over all others, stolen birthrights, 100-year-old women giving birth. The book of Genesis is filled with all of the drama, the wild and ridiculous plot points, the crazy moral dilemmas, the weird family dynamics of all of those soap operas I saw my grandmother watching. And so we could ask ourselves the same question of, why do we read Genesis given all of those soap opera-like qualities? And for me, it's a reminder that there has never really been a honeymoon phase in humankind's relationship with God. That from the beginning, it's always been messy, and that we've always been wrestling with what it means to follow God. It's as true today as it was then. And there's this deep sense of grace in the book of Genesis. That despite all of the ways we mess up, despite all of the vulgarities and the brokenness of our world, this is the world that God chooses to interact with. That this is the world that God chooses to be in relationship with. And so the soap opera that is Genesis spends the vast majority of its time dealing with one family, Abraham, Sarah, and their descendants. The pilot episode takes place in Genesis chapter 12 when God calls Abraham and Sarah, at that time known as Abram and Sarai, out of a place called Ur of the Chaldeans. God had been unknown to them until this moment, but they leave behind their homeland and everything they've ever known to follow this God, on the promise that they will receive children and that they will be made into a great nation. But as is the case with so many of the Bible's characters who are promised things by God, doubt quickly creeps in. They become impatient in their waiting, wondering when God will do what God has promised. Abraham questions God's fidelity. When will you give us children, he asks. When will we become this great nation you promised us? And then God takes Abraham outside and says, "Look up into the night sky and see if you can count the stars. You've lost count already? That's how numerous your descendants will be. That's how great of a nation I will make of you." This is God's covenant with Abraham. This is God's irrevocable promise to which God will always be faithful. And God even shows Abraham the boundaries of the land that he will live on and the land that will be the inheritance to his family down throughout all ages. But Abraham and Sarah are extremely anxious and impatient in waiting for these promises to become true. And so when it doesn't happen on their schedule, they decide to try and force God's hand and make it happen for themselves. In the very next chapter, in the very next section, after God and Abraham have this beautiful heart-to-heart where they look up into the stars of heaven, Sarah says to Abraham, "We've waited long enough. We've been in this land that God promised us for 10 years, and we still don't have any children. In fact, God is preventing me from having children. So we need to make it happen for ourselves. I have this Egyptian slave girl named Hagar. Take her as your second wife so that we can have children by her." Hagar could have easily passed through history without her name ever being written down. She could have been one of those billions upon billions of people who have lived their lives and who have been lost to history. But she finds herself caught up in the scheming of these two powerful people who have all of the money, the land, and the earthly possessions they could have ever wanted. And she herself becomes one of their possessions. In their quest for children, Hagar finds herself at their mercy. She has no choice in the matter. She is their slave. She must do whatever Sarah decides she must do. They view her life and her body as if it were something that they could have possession and control over. And the writer of Genesis really hits home on this point because they say that Sarah took Hagar and gave her to her husband as his second wife for the purposes of producing a child for them. And Hagar does become pregnant, and she seems to try and assert herself in her new position because she is now the pregnant wife of this wealthy man, and so she tries to flip the social hierarchy between her and Sarah. She at least views herself at the same level as Sarah, if not higher than her. But Sarah is not having that. She goes to Abraham and says, "Hey, don't you see what's happening? Don't you see how I'm being mistreated? I gave you Hagar as my slave and as your second wife, and now she tries to act like she owns the place. Do something about it." But Abraham, perhaps sitting in his easy chair, not wanting to play referee between his two wives, says, "Hagar is your slave. You have power over her. Do with her what you want." And so Sarah begins abusing and mistreating Hagar. And it gets so bad that Hagar runs off into the wilderness. But then God sees her by a spring of water. "Hagar, where are you coming from and where are you going?" "Sarah has been abusing me and mistreating me, so I'm running away." But then in an act that's hard for us modern readers to swallow, God tells Hagar to return back to her abusers, to go live with Abraham and Sarah. But God doesn't send her away empty-handed. In this difficult exchange, God gives Hagar the same promises that were given to Abraham. "I will greatly increase your offspring. I will multiply them so greatly that they can't be counted." And then God names her unborn son Ishmael. This is often the case in the Bible, that God is the one who names and renames people. Names in the ancient world carried power. They carried the reputation and described the character of the person who bore that name. And God changes Abram's name to Abraham. God names Ishmael and Isaac. After wrestling with God, Jacob's name is changed to Israel. God is the one who gives names. But according to Rachel Held Evans, there is one exception to this rule where a human being gets to name God. And it's not a prophet, a king, or a soldier. But it's Hagar, the foreigner, the slave, the powerless outsider who gets to name God. And she names God El Roi, the God who sees. The God who sees not the powerful in their places of privilege, but the God who sees this scared slave woman in distress and responds with compassion. The God who sees a woman who is pregnant with a child that will not be her own, but will belong to her master's, and gives her the promise that indeed this child will be hers and she will have offspring that will be abundant and cannot be counted. God sees this woman in despair and gives her hope for a future. So never forget that it was Hagar, the slave, the foreigner, and in that moment a refugee from violence and persecution, who gets to name God. She gives to God a name and a reputation, a description of God's character, the God who sees. She gets to tell us something about who God is. After she goes back and Ishmael is born, over the next several chapters, I wonder if that experience sustained her. Over the next 14 years, as God reaffirmed God's covenant with Abraham, as they received the promise of a son, as they witnessed the destruction of the unjust cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, did Hagar live her life knowing that God saw her? Maybe it gave her a sense of self-worth. Yes, she was a slave in Abraham and Sarah's privileged world, but she was also an heir to God's promises. She was not a nobody. She was not invisible. But she had human dignity because God saw her and God was with her. As Ishmael grew up, did she tell him the story of what happened in the wilderness? Did she tell him about God who sees? Did she tell him how special he was? That while he was still being formed inside of her, God saw him and named him and gave him a place and a future. I think she did tell him that story. Because after Isaac, the son of Abraham and Sarah, is born, and after he was weaned, there was this great celebration. And in the midst of the celebration, Sarah saw that son of Hagar. She can't even name him. She saw that son of Hagar playing with Isaac. And this sets Sarah off. She can't have Ishmael playing with Isaac. What's really happening here? There are several options for interpretation, but the one that makes the most sense to me is the fact that Isaac's name means playing or laughing. And so there is a play on words happening here, that Ishmael is playing the part of Isaac. He is literally Isaacing, pretending to take his place in his role in the promises given to Abraham and Sarah. Ishmael seems to believe that the promises are also for him, the son of a slave, just as much as they are for Isaac, the son of power and privilege. But Sarah can't live with the idea of that son of Hagar being on equal footing with her own son. And so she one more time goes to Abraham and says, "Hey, did you see what happened over there? That son of Hagar is not the same as Isaac. They will never be the same. Send them both away. I don't want them in this house anymore." Abraham, who has grown to love Ishmael because he is his son, is greatly distressed by this. But God says to Abraham, "Let them go. Ishmael and Hagar are in my care just as they have been all of their days. Trust that I will take care of them. Trust that the promises given to you are also given to them." And so Abraham gets up early in the morning, gets some bread and water, and sends Hagar and Ishmael on their way. Hagar once again finds herself in the wilderness with her son. This time it's not because she ran away, but because she has been cast out, sent to fend for herself and for her child. In the heat of the desert, it doesn't take long for the water to run out, and so Hagar walks away from Ishmael. She puts him under a bush and she goes away from him so that he doesn't see her worrying, doesn't see how concerned she is, so that he doesn't see the desperation that they're actually in. "Don't let my child die," Hagar says. And she weeps and cries out to the God who sees, hoping that God will once again look upon her and respond to her distress. As you all know, this past week was Vacation Bible School, and in exploring our theme of finding Jesus, our kids also spent time learning about those in our world who don't have access to clean water. Water is life, and without it, we wouldn't be alive. Yet so many in our world live under the dark shadow of the global water crisis. From places like Flint, Michigan, to parts of Africa and Southeast Asia, there are millions of mothers just like Hagar, crying out for their children who are thirsty, crying out that they may not die. In the 25 years from 1990 to 2015, tremendous progress was made in addressing the global water crisis. During that time, 2.6 billion people gained access to clean water, which was an increase of 25% of the world's population. But there is still a lot of work to be done. 844 million people still lack access to clean water, and 1 in 3 people in the world lack access to sanitation. Water scarcity has created more refugees than all of the wars of human history. The global water crisis disproportionately affects women and girls, those who are just like Hagar. In some places in the world, women and girls have to search for water for up to 6 hours a day, not allowing them to go to school or to work, and locking them in cycles of poverty. But when clean water is available, then women have a greater sense of autonomy, they have the ability to improve their lives and to live with a greater sense of dignity and self-worth. Every 15 seconds, a child like Ishmael dies because of water scarcity. But when clean water is made available, it gives them new life. When they don't have to go searching for it, it allows them to go to school, ensuring that they can receive an education. And in a church full of professors and teachers, we know how important an education is, that it allows people to have better opportunities in life. The God who sees, who looked upon Hagar when she was running away from persecution, is now the God who hears. As Hagar is crying out for water, God, through an angel, says to her, "Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." Where he is. That's an amazing line. God hears Ishmael where he is. And God sees and hears all of the Hagars and Ishmaels of our world who are crying out for water to drink. And God decides to do something about it and provides for them a well of water so that they have water to drink and that they have hope for the future. For us then, how do we reorient our lives in service to the God who sees? To hear the cries of people where they are. How do we focus our eyes to see those who are living without access to clean water? And how do we bend our ears to hear them, to live in faithful response? Our kids have already forged a path for us. Throughout the week, they have been donating money to a project called Living Waters for the World. Living Waters for the World was actually developed by the Synod of Living Waters in the Presbyterian Church, and they train volunteers to partner with communities around the world to implement sustainable water purification systems that ensure that they have a lasting ability to treat dirty water and make sure that it is clean, safe, and drinkable. Our VBS kids spent some time during the lock-in on Friday night building structures out of canned food for us to vote on and to donate our money to. Every dollar that we collect will be donated to the Living Waters for the World project and their mission to make sure that all of God's children have clean water. The canned food from those structures will be donated to a local food pantry. And so on our way out today, as we head over to the Colliers for summer fun, and some of that fun includes water, swimming, and fishing, please stop by downstairs to check out the structures that they've worked on and to donate to Living Waters for the World that provides water for all of the Hagars and Ishmaels of our world. May we be the people of God who sees the suffering and who hears the cries of those who are in deep need and respond with lives of faithful action and compassionate concern. Amen.